and welcome to our 11th Global Public Seminar in Comparative and International Education. These seminars are jointly organized, as many of you already might know, by the Department of Education and St. Edmund Hall at the University of Oxford. My name is Maria Changseviani. I am Associate Professor of Comparative and International Education here at Oxford. We have a wonderful speaker, Dr. Peter Kelly, today with us. And before I introduce our speaker in greater detail, let me attend to a few administrative points. Okay. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted online in due course. We will only record the first half of this webinar, the presentation itself. We won't be recording the Q&A. Please keep yourself muted throughout the webinar unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. To ask a question, use the chat function, please. Write out the question you wish to ask in the chat. At the end of the presentation, if your question is selected, you will be invited to ask it yourself directly. When I invite you to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from. We have 5 more seminars advertised at the end of this academic year till around July, I think. In the next few moments, I will share a link in the chat to the webpage where you can learn about the topics of the forthcoming seminars, and you can use the same link to book your place if you are interested to attend any of those. I will also share a link to the YouTube page where you can listen to our past seminars. Now, let me admit a few more people who are trying to join, and let me introduce today's speaker. Dr. Peter Kelly is Reader in Comparative Education at the University of Plymouth here in the United Kingdom. Before moving into higher education, Peter spent 15 years working in primary and middle schools in London and also in Southwest England, including 5 years as a deputy head and 5 years as a head teacher. So he brings in a lot of experience from English schools. He taught across the primary and middle school age ranges in schools serving socially mixed, socially disadvantaged, rural and inner city areas. Peter Kelly's research explores the working lives of school leaders and teachers in the UK and in Europe. Positioned between critical approaches to educational leadership, international and comparative education, and education policy, his studies examine how market governance privileges some education traditions and practices over others. He also studies the effect of this on school leaders, on school teachers, students, and implications for the public good. Let me let a few more attendees in. Peter Kelly's research also explores some of the reasons for rising populism in Europe and the consequences of this for liberal democracies, with a view to informing an educational response. He has sought to map the extent and progression of neoliberal educational reform in European national contexts, analyzing how this has shaped pedagogy and its impact on teachers and students. His studies explore how marketization, managerialism, and performativity in education, mobilized by high-stakes student testing and test-based accountability regimes, widen educational inequality and increase teacher and student alienation. This afternoon, Peter Kelly will talk about the research conducted with 2 of his colleagues, Susan Hofbauer, Helmut Schmidt University, Hamburg, and Barbara Gross, Free University of Bolzano. This team of researchers compared national education policy responses to the Covid-19 pandemic in England, Germany, and Italy to explore negotiations about the public good and identify to a certain extent the role of research the research played in framing, legitimizing, and rendering trustworthy the settlements reached. Without further ado, I will now pass over to Peter. The floor is yours.
Many thanks, Maya, and many thanks for inviting me to speak here today. Yeah, as you said, the research is conducted with 2 colleagues, and I would like to thank them for being involved in it, and also hope that at least if there are any difficult questions about the German and Italian context, that they are here today and would help me in answering them. This is published research, and the publication is full of very, very detailed examples. I really haven't got time today to go through all of those examples. So if you are interested, there is a reference at the end of a presentation to the paper in the European Education Research Journal, which was published last year, and which is much more detailed than anything I can hope to do today. What I did hope to do today is to show how the use of Bourdieu's theory of the state is helpful in comparative research, and particularly in understanding the state organization and policy contexts, how these are important considerations when looking at comparative policy making, and particularly here in response to this the pandemic. So I'm going to just put some slides up. Okay, so I want you to just think back, because I think it's quite difficult from the perspective we are now in, 2 years on, of what it felt like in January 2020, and what it felt like in the very first months in March here in the UK, and similar time in Italy and in Germany. What it felt like when schools were closing. I think we because we sought the initiative and we conducted this research as it was happening, we didn't place ourselves in that difficulty. But I think now, presenting the research and thinking back what it was like at the time, and the uncertainty, the huge amount of uncertainty, I think it's very easy to forget what, perhaps we forget deliberately because it was such a difficult time. But nevertheless, I want you to remember that. And also I want you to be very aware of the very limited time frame of the research. The research was in the very first months of the pandemic and the closure of schools. So we're going to go back to that time. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about framing the research before I talk to you about what we did and what we looked at and what we found. This was kind of an opportunity. It was an opportunity for us that was quite unique, because it's allowed us to look at how 3 very different states responded to a common set of events. An existential crisis, as it was regarded by many, where the level of preparation had been pretty varied from country to country. But for most, although there had been warnings that this kind of thing would happen, for most countries and most governments, they were pretty unprepared for what happened. The other thing that was interesting was there was very little time for any form of supranational coordination. Although OECD, for example, did publish a few documents early on, which were there to support, and conducted produced a range of papers that talked about the preparedness of different countries for the kind of education changes that would need to be made. Generally, they had very little impact in the first part of the pandemic. So this was an interesting time for us to look at the way that different states responded. And what we were able to kind of do was consider these changes in the light that each of the 3 countries that we chose to look at were very different in their organization, in their policy cultures and contexts, and also in the circumstances that they faced. Now, in particular, we wanted to look at education, because education had to adapt. It had to adapt to medical changing circumstances. It was also concerned with the economic circumstances, and of course, it was concerned with the social well-being of young people and the education provision that was necessary for them, as well as the social provision that was necessary for them. So it had a foot in three camps, and so it was a wonderful policy area to examine in that respect, to see how the different dynamics played out in each of these very different contexts. And so what we wanted to do was to explore the responses, but also to explore how those responses came about, the negotiations that led to the various policies. And in particular, we wanted to see how different forms of research were being used to frame policy decisions, to legitimate policy decisions, and to render trustworthy, to allow people to believe and buy into policy decisions when they will come to, so when they have been made. And so we were particularly interested in seeing how research played in this. I just need to talk a little bit about these three contexts. I'd say they're quite different. Certainly, there's been extensive writing about the nature of the state and about the way in which there exists in England what we might call a public interest state. Public interest in the sense that long-standing, should we say, long-standing suspicions of governments mean that governments are constantly seeking to build and maintain public trust and consent. And where alongside that, there are multiple actors who are constantly seeking to hold ministers to account and to hold government to account. So you've got this notion of the state being in this constant interplay with public opinion, with public demand, with different voices in the media and in wider circles of civil society, and constantly on show, constantly open to scrutiny, and constantly being held to account. This, alongside what had been a highly disaggregated state over years and years of market reform, elements of state provision, had been opened up to tender, had been offered to different companies, had been semi-privatized, had become the remit of different bodies that had been broken off from the state and had gained a place, a semi-separate place, and were able to hold different opinions from the government, from the voice of the government, from the government's own interests. So you get what Jessup calls this disaggregated state in England, and within that context, we've still got a strong emphasis. We've got a strong emphasis on not only the disaggregation of the state, but keeping different school actors, whether it's multi-academy trusts or whether it's different forms of school provision, still some school provision which is under local authority control, but keeping them together through a system of hard governance through high stakes testing and high stakes inspections. And then in contrast to that, we have the German context, a polycentric context, so different decision-making bodies in each of the federal lands, where education is a part of the remit of the lands, and where central government has a much lesser role, although there is some coordination in the central government, and where there have been some limited market reforms. For example, there's been a move towards output governance. There's been an introduction of some inspection and testing arrangements, but all of which are low stake, and which people have called the neo-Weberian state because it still maintains this bureaucratic centralized control, but it has been opened up to some limited market reform in order to increase its efficiency. And then in Italy, we have, again, a bureaucratic state, rather centralized, but also where there are a number of challenges. So in the period leading up to the crisis, frequent changes of government had meant that there wasn't an education policy had not been continuous and developed in a progressive manner, but had been fragmented because of frequent changes of government, had not always been the highest priority because economic concerns had been prioritised above education. And so expenditure on education had not been as high as in England or in Germany as a proportion of GDP. But also where there were a lot of infrastructural constraints, particularly in the south. And so schools often were in areas where there were certain, say, a lack of investment in school buildings. Schools were often, in the south, for example, were often under-resourced. There hadn't been the possibility to develop a digital infrastructure. And the whole range of other constraints, which we'll come to later, which affected the way in which policy could be implemented in schools in the face of this crisis. So three very different contexts, which allowed us to look at how they each responded to this common crisis. I just need to mention a little bit about Bourdieu's theory of the state here, because it's not always, when people think of Bourdieu, they don't always think of his theory of the state. And I think it's something that we found extremely useful in providing a way of framing our analysis. One of the things that Bourdieu, Bourdieu agrees with Weber that the state has a monopoly over the use of violence, but he adds the notion that the state is also has a monopoly over the infliction of symbolic violence, because it assigns status to different groups and different individuals, and it has, through the way it does that, an ability to exert power over different groups. In effect, it's kind of the arbiter of status in society. Now, if we think about the public good, this is a problematic term, and what Bourdieu says is that the state claims to serve the public good, but there is no single public good. And so it is the negotiation over claims to the public good that the state becomes part of, it becomes embroiled in. If we think about the different groups within society, then different groups have different values, many of which are incommensurate. So some groups may value freedom, others may value equality. And if you are seeking to increase the freedom of individuals, then inevitably you may have to deny them certain equalities, or vice versa. Religious values, for example, can deny rights to women, to homosexuals, whereas secular values might deny rights to religious groups to hold such views. And so you constantly engaged in a negotiation between different values. And if we think about, for example, what it means to lead a good life, then within society, there are many groups representing different views of what it may mean to lead a good life, to provide a good education, to be a good teacher, to be a good student, to be a good employee, and so on and so forth. And because of this multiple plurality of views and of values, the state is constantly involved in mediating negotiations between different groups in order to have a settlement of what at a particular moment the public good is. So the public good is something which changes over time. It's something which is negotiated. It's something which is fluid, and it's something which can respond to circumstances. And one of the points that we make in the paper and in this study is that the public good was negotiated over the early part of this crisis and continues to be negotiated by the state as the crisis proceeds, and at the moment as well. Now, within those negotiations, different actors contribute to the negotiations, but for Bourdieu, it's always although there are multiple interests being represented in those negotiations, it's always the interests of the most powerful groups which are ascendant. They always have the most say in the negotiations. And so inevitably, whatever happens in the negotiations, large groups of people have to consent to agreements on what is in the public good or the public interest, which may not be in their own personal interests. And part of the negotiation that happens is how does the state gain consent from minority groups, from subaltern groups, from groups who are not represented, for example, in the decisions, but who have to go along with those decisions. In fact, groups, for example, as happened in the crisis, like young people who were involved in decision making that was catering largely for a vulnerable and elderly population. And so there is a certain amount of building a consent that has to happen in the states to take those groups along with it. So that's where we were using Bourdieu's theory of the states. Now, just that fairly quick introduction shows you how, I hope, how it would work when we started to look at what happened. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting, and Jenny Oscar points this out, well, we all know this, is the relationship between policymaking and research. So how policymakers use research and how researchers present their ideas to policymakers is hugely complex and contested. On the one hand, technocratic government is criticised as anti-democratic and privileging particular interests. And then on the other hand, as is common in many of the responses we found, politicians make use of scientific and social research to legitimize their decisions. Because what they want to do is give the impression of disinterest. They want to give the impression that they are acting and being led by the science rather than making political decisions that are led by their own contingencies. And so this notion that within policy debates, we're looking for how the positions of the policy actors are depoliticized by their invocation of research. But in so doing, they are choosing certain forms of research, they're choosing certain studies, they're choosing research that represents certain ways of looking at the world. They are thereby politicizing research. They're using it for political ends. And this was part of how we wanted to look and see what was happening within these negotiations of the public good in each of the three countries. What was the role research was playing? What ways were politicians and other policy actors using research in order to forward their positions in these negotiations? Was it actually effective? Did people attend more to the positions they were taking because they were citing research? If so, what kinds of research were they citing? These were the kind of things we were interested in. And whether it was common across the three countries or whether it was particular to each of them, which kinds of research had the most clout or the most impact. And of course, as this slide shows, each of the three countries already had a relationship with research in education. So within England, there had developed a fairly strong tradition, harkening back to Hargreaves' speech of 1996. There'd been a strong position to make greater use of evidence in education practice and policy. And to a point where there were, and there still are, a number of brokerage agencies that provide summaries of research to support decision-making and practice. Now, this is very much an emergent position in Germany, and there are similar brokerage agencies within the German context, but their aim is less at practitioners, less at people making decisions in schools, and more at what we might call middle tier decision makers, so people that with various roles within each of the federal lands. And they then use their understanding of research to support people in schools. Whereas in Italy, very much this was still the preserve of researchers, and the policymakers were less influenced by, at the time anyway, by research evidence and systematic reviews of evidence carried out before in preparation for policy making, and the kind of things that were kind of common practice in England. So each of the three contexts had a very different relationship to education research and social research as well. So what we actually did was we as I say, we were only really engaged in looking at the beginning of the crisis when the schools closed. Okay, so we began mid-February. Most of the schools closed in March in the three contexts, and we ran through till the end of May. We looked at, to begin with, news media reports, but we had to be very careful, and so we tried to look at television news reports. We looked at serious newspaper and specialist education sector news websites. And so in the UK, for example, we looked at The Guardian and The Times as serious newspaper. Special education websites, we looked at The Times Educational Supplement. And in television news, we looked at the BBC. So we were able to, within each of the three contexts, we were looking at, specifically, we were targeting not editorials, but we were looking at reports of debates between different policy actors. So we were looking at reports that were common in the different media. Maybe they had different takes on the debates, but we were looking at the common elements. What we were seeking was a starting point then to substantiate accounts that were provided in these different debates using further published documentary evidence. And so we would look at for example, if they were talking about scientists' reports, we would go and seek out the minutes of the meetings to substantiate what we had found in the news media. Because what we were seeking was an account in a very short period of time where there was a huge amount going on. We were seeking to see what kind, and without having access to interview all of the different participants, we were seeking an account of the policy negotiations and the negotiations over the public good that were occurring in each of the three contexts. Okay, I just want to talk very briefly about the three countries' responses to begin with, and just aware of time. I know I'll give you.
We have around 10 more minutes, Peter. If that's
okay. Thank you, ma'am. What I'll do then is I'll just give a few brief examples, but maybe if people want some more, then you can ask about them. We can talk about that later. So I'll go through some of this quite quickly. Okay, in England, for example, one of the first decisions that was made was to keep schools open for key workers. So that was an economic decision based on the idea that certain people had to stay in their employment and they required childcare. Similar decisions were made for key professionals in Germany, and later that also happened in Italy. There was a far less focus in Germany and Italy on what should happen to children from vulnerable groups. So if we just put the key workers to one side, then we look at other students. Some students were more in need of remaining in schools than others. So for example, children with special educational needs, children with a migrant background who perhaps had to have wanted to have continued exposure to a national language, and if they were staying at home, they wouldn't have that exposure. So there were certain groups where it would be advantageous to keep them in school, rather than to consign them to homeschooling. And in England, there was some decision made there. So it was particularly groups with special educational needs and groups that were deemed as being in danger if they stayed at home. So groups, for example, where there was some sort of social service involvement. This was not the case in Germany and Italy. And what happened in there largely, and of course, I'm talking here about in Germany, for example, where some of the different lands responded differently to others. But what largely happened was there was a notion that there would be retrospective action. For example, there will be summer provision, or there will be later additional provision that would then help these students catch up. Okay. Now, I'll talk a little bit about what this means in relation to Bourdieu later on, but if we just move on to the notion of digital technologies, again, a very interesting contrast between the three countries. Within Germany, there had already before COVID been a long-standing debate about development of digital provision. Many of the surveys prior to the pandemic had identified lack of teacher competence and confidence as being a major issue. And so it was really unsurprising that there was very little impetus for digital provision when the pandemic originally arose. Within the different school provision groups of schools and area areas with a common oversight, there was not a great deal of planning for increased digital learning. One of the main concerns was also this kind of notion that some people had access to digital devices and others didn't. In Italy, however, lessons went online immediately. But there was also a notion within Italy that there could be some sort of compensation in the meantime. So, for example, teachers might use telephones, they might distribute notes through the post, for example. They may get students to share notes with each other. In England, however, there had been a long-standing commitment to technology in schools. But what there wasn't in England was a common digital platform. And so what happened almost immediately is that government put in provision to provide support for students without digital devices, which also happened in Germany and Italy. But what they also did was, alongside Google, who put in a huge amount of funding, and other bodies as well, commissioned a digital environment, the Oak Academy, which was developed by a group of 40 teachers in a multi-academy trust situation, where they provided online lessons and very quickly developed a resource that could be used by parents at home and by teachers in schools who were to support teaching. Now, that wasn't without its problems, but I think this notion that the market situation in England allowed a very speedy response is interesting. And that the long-standing commitment to digital technological provision in England also meant that teachers were by and large confident in that situation is also interesting. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't without problems, and I'll come back to that shortly. When we come then to reopening schools, by the time we come to the middle of this period that we were looking at, April to May, even from March, there was a call for schools to start opening. And the interesting thing here is that there were, I'm going to have to summarize this rather quickly, but there were two kind of dynamics going on, one in Germany and Italy and a second in England, which were in one sense opposite to each other. Within England, there was a push from government to reopen schools, and it was a push that arose because of concerns about vulnerable children and children missing schooling, particularly low achievers missing huge amounts of face-to-face and provision with their teachers, and some of the concerns about the quality and nature of homeschooling that was happening at the time. Now, that was set against trade union worries, which were largely about the health of teachers if children returned to schools. And at the time, there was a great division within the medical data about whether children could actually be carriers of the virus or not. So the negotiations that were going on were very dynamic. There were parties, multiple parties, looking from different perspectives, arguing for and against the reopening of schools. in the end, what happened was there were two loose coalitions formed, one between the government and the chief executives of multi-academy trusts who wanted to open schools. And then on the other hand, there was a group of trade unions allied to a group of people, senior officers in local government, who were absolutely against that. And because of the uncertainty of the situation medically, rather than any educational evidence, eventually it came to pass that the government had to back down and schools remained closed. Now, in Germany and Italy, it was the other way around. Government wanted to keep the schools closed, whereas there were many bodies, including researchers, university, a series of open letters by university lecturers in Germany and professors, lots of concern about the need to reopen schools. And so what we there have is the German government or the Italian government maintaining a position where schools would remain largely closed in the face of various parties, including parents' groups, including some employers, arguing strongly that schools should reopen. But in the end, in that particular argument, the government simply was able to maintain its stance and say, no, that's the way we're managing things, that's what's happening, and largely ignored these various bodies that were attempting to negotiate, but in fact there was no negotiation because there was no leverage that these different groups could place on governments in order to negotiate in the way that in England, with the multiple with the way that governments had become fragmented, these different groups had a huge amount of leverage, and coupled to the notion that in England public opinion through the public interest state was highly important to government. And so what you end up having is the governments in England losing the arguments to open schools, whereas in Germany and Italy, the government maintained its position and schools were able to stay closed, which was the argument they were making. They were making the opposite argument. Just going back to Bourdieu then. So what we have to then bear in mind is that in periods of crisis, habitus becomes misaligned as fields change. And so when you have, for example, people who are required to work from home, then the field of work has changed. And so habitus, in a sense, is uncoupled from field, and the advantages that and the security that you felt you had is shaken. And so when we have periods of crisis, what it brings with it is a possibility of increased conflicts and a degree of resentment. Now, within these kind of situations, politicians trying to maintain control need to be seen to be serving the welfare of all without favour. So the mechanism behind what's happening is that politicians are wanting to invoke this idea of them being disinterested, of serving the welfare of all. And what they need to do is to draw on particular certainties. Now, in the neo-Weberian states, they can draw on the certainties of law, and they can be seen to be implementing the law without favour in a fair and transparent manner. But within the fragmented market state, the law plays a far lesser role. It's still important, of course. So what you have is a situation where policymakers and different policy actors need to draw far more on other certainties, the certainties of science, maybe even the certainties of tradition. Okay, I'm getting there.
Thank you, Peter. If we go towards
So very much so. What I've just to summarise some of the points I've made, and if I've captured your imagination, please go to the paper for more detail on this. What we have then in England is a situation where there are multiple interests, some of them commercial, loose alliances. For example, I gave the example between the local authority, the local government officials and between trade teacher unions, forming loose alliances. Some for, some against government policy. Within the German and Italian states, you have a far greater sense of cohesion. Now, it's not a clear cohesion. You know, you'll still find when you look at the paper and you look at the examples we provide, lots of instances where there's disagreement. But what you don't get is this complete fragmentation that you end up in England. Because of the fragmentation, there's a diversity of decision-making actors. So individual schools in England can decide whether or not they are going to open or close. The government cannot make them do so, and that is part of the interesting dynamic that is happening within the English context. In Germany, each of the different federal lands was making different decisions, but at one point, there was a need for coordination, and so the ministers in central government together had to agree to coordinate their actions. Whereas in Italy, what had become a regional decision-making body very quickly became centralized and hierarchical, and that was justified because of the extraordinary nature of the pandemic. Clearly, medical evidence trumped everything and was strong in shaping everything that happened. But as time went on in this brief period at the start of 2020, so first economic and then social concerns began to raise their heads. However, very little at that time attention was given to educational expertise. And this was obvious across all three countries. However, the market reform within England allowed a very speedy response, as I said, particularly to the lack of a digital platform. But it was a market response, and it was largely tailored to the needs of teachers. So what we get was teacher-led, highly structured materials that really didn't allow too much student investigation, student exploration, student-led directed activity. They were very much built on the kind of teaching model that was already very dominant within the English context. Within the other contexts, within Germany and Italy, let me just mention quickly about Italy. I mean, one of the things which was very interesting in the Italian context was that schools were wanting to reopen, but simply because of the infrastructural concerns, they couldn't provide, for example, the social distancing that was required to allow them to do so. Now, as businesses were opening left, right, and centre, this placed the government in a tricky position, because the challenge that was made to them is, if you can open businesses, why can't you reopen schools? And the answer, of course, was that people were able to and willing to invest in business to allow the safety provision that would allow people to do so in a healthy and safe way. But there wasn't the investment in schools that allowed that. The infrastructural weaknesses in schools meant that they had to stay closed. So just to finish, when we look at this particular complex picture, Jenny Oscar said, much to the frustration of politicians, research is messy, occasionally imprecise, mistaken, opens up debate to alternative interpretations, alternative analyses, and it's sometimes research is inconclusive. Now, what politicians want is they want to be able to provide certainty, but what they can't then, the problem with that is that when politicians start presenting their policies as being backed up by research, it's very obvious that they have chosen research to suit that ends, because there is such a diversity within the research, there is so much complexity within the research, that it becomes quite clear quite quickly that they have interpreted that research in a particular way, and others would interpret it differently. Now, in the English context, that allows people who are challenging government policy, be it trade unions or be it local authority leaders, to say, to use medical arguments to keep schools closed when governments are arguing that it's perfectly safe to open schools, because the evidence is contradictory, and this affects public confidence. And it also allows people to argue that that research is being used in a way that is not disinterested, but rather is being used to back up particular arguments. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this insightful